Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
So what was Paul like as a kid or as a child? Do we know anything about him, either from his letters and or from the Acts of the Apostles? What do we know about Paul? What we know about Paul is that his name was not Paul. We've gone over this before. Paul's name was actually Saul. And so the young Saul was raised, and it's interesting because his name, he was always known as Saul, but then after his conversion, he went by a different name. In Latin it was Paulus. In English we just know him simply as Paul. And so it's interesting because letter A points out that Saul was likely born around 5 to 10 CE in the Common Era, or we often call it AD. So if Jesus was born more or less somewhere between 4 to 6 BC, this is saying that Paul was likely born somewhere around 5 to 10 AD. So how much younger would Paul have been than Christ? Probably at least some 9 to 16 years younger than Jesus. Acts 7:58 describes Saul as a young man at the stoning of Stephen. And notice I'm using Saul purposely, only because his name was Saul. So as a young man, his name was Saul up until the time he was converted. And so the Acts 7:58 describes Saul as a young man at the stoning of Stephen. The letter C tells us that people often had two names, one Greek or Roman name, which in this case, Paul had his Greek or Roman name, Roman in this case, Paulus, and one Semitic name, Semitic, the languages of that area, of the Middle East, the ancient Middle East, the Semitic lands, they had one name in that language too. It would be like the example that we could use is for a person who comes from Mexico. In Mexico, his name was Jose. What happens? He comes to the United States and suddenly his name is Joe, right? Her name could have been Petra in Mexico. Essentially, she moves to the United States and she's Patsy, right? And so here it's another example of people who are known by two names. What happens in the case of Paul? We have we have a person, Paul, who is known by two names. In Romans 11:1 and Philippians 3:5, Paul says that he's from the tribe of Benjamin. Interesting. So if Paul is from the tribe of Benjamin, then he descended from all these ancestors. Who was Benjamin again? We remember our course in the Pentateuch. Our ancestors in the faith were Abraham. Abraham's son was Isaac. Isaac's son was Jacob. And then Jacob had 12 sons. He had many sons, 12 or more. And one of those sons was Benjamin. How interesting then that a person like Paul, like Jesus, could trace his lineage all the way back to those ancestors in the faith. Do we remember who the first king in the Old Testament is? The first king in the Hebrew Scriptures? His name was Saul as well. When we hear king, we think of people like David and Solomon, but the first king was actually King Saul. And so for a young man like young Saul, he was likely named after King Saul. Paul doesn't tell us where he was from, but the Acts of the Apostles suggest that he was a citizen of Tarsus, and so for all we know, he may or may not have been born there. It's one of those things where we'll never know. We have no birth certificate. There was no hospital back then that said that he was born in a certain place at a certain day, and so we'll always speculate, unless some other document comes to light, we'll always speculate where it was that Paul was born. Paul was a Jew, and so it would make sense if Paul were from Tarsus. Tarsus had a big Jewish colony, and so you could easily follow the argument that if Paul were from Tarsus, that he would be from Tarsus and be part of that Jewish colony there. What else do we know about Paul or the young Saul based on either Paul's writings and or the Acts of the Apostles? Well, we know that Paul's letters were written in what language? All of the New Testament books were written in Greek. The Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures were written in Hebrew. The New Testament was written in Greek. And so when we look at, for instance, the Gospel of Mark, we see some good Greek. When we studied the Gospels, we found out how it was that there were some authors that didn't write very good Greek. They were using words and expressions that either were doubled or that had different meanings from what persons at that time would have understood. And so we know that Paul actually wrote pretty good Greek. What does that mean about him as a young man? He probably had a good education. He wrote Greek well. He had rhetorical skills in his letters. We're going to see how it is that he argued, how persuasive he was. He quoted the scriptures in Greek, and so all that tells us that he had a good command of Greek, and he had access to the scriptures in Greek. When we say the scriptures, what are we referring to? We're referring to the Hebrew scriptures that had been translated into Greek. So the Hebrew scriptures were written in Hebrew, but then they were later translated into Greek. That translation we often know as the Septuagint, simply because the tradition was that 70 or 72 elders translated those Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Acts 18:3 suggests that Saul was what? He was a tent maker. Have we heard that before? We know that various persons exercise various skills, that Jesus was a tekton, which could be translated a handyman, or some people say a carpenter. So Jesus had a trade. Paul as well had his trade. He worked as a tent maker. Letter G. We also know that Paul understood the major role of the household in Greco-Roman culture. So in the Greco-Roman culture, the pater familias was the head of the household, and there was a definite structure to each household. St. Paul was familiar with that. He was also familiar with the lives of ordinary Gentiles. Remember that Gentiles are non-Jews. Paul preached among the Gentiles. So other people like Peter and James focused on the Jews. Paul's focus was not on the Jews. It was more on Acts 22:3 suggests that Saul was raised in Jerusalem and educated by Gamaliel the first, Gamaliel the elder. The challenge is simply reconciling that. So we have this second-hand source, Luke, who thought that Paul was raised in Jerusalem. But at the same time, we don't have anything from Paul's letters that confirm that. You know, is there anything that would suggest, for instance, that Paul was in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus? It seems that if Paul were in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, that Paul would have said something about that in one of his letters. You know, when I used to live in Jerusalem, I heard stories about Jesus, and so one day I went out to see him. You know, if he lived in Jerusalem during the time of Jesus, it seems that, that he would have said something about that. Instead, it seems that his first encounter with Jesus was on the road to Damascus, was his conversion. Paul describes himself as a Hebrew and a Pharisee, and that's consistent with what we read in Acts. So this is one of those cases where we take a look at what Paul says, and we see whether or not it agrees with what Acts says, and that's one instance in which we see that that's likely true. That Paul saw himself as being both a Hebrew and a Pharisee. Acts also describes Saul as the son of Pharisees. And Acts 26:4-5 says that Saul was a Pharisee from his youth. So, which religion was Paul raised in? It seems that Paul was raised in the Jewish faith by Pharisees, so he was brought up as a young Pharisee himself. We talked about the Pharisees before. The Pharisees were those who believed in resurrection, who believed in angels. There were different things about the Pharisees that sets them apart from other people like the Sadducees in Jesus' day. Galatians 1:14 suggests that Saul was a zealous Jew, well advanced beyond many of his own age. So it just gives us the impression, St. Paul leads us to believe that he was a smart guy, a precocious little youth who was zealous about his Jewishness, who knew a lot about the Jewish faith, and was ahead of his peers. Saul likely knew Hebrew and or Aramaic. Why do we think that? As we're going to see in the chronology of his life, in the timeline of his life, there are different times when he's going to find himself in the area of Jerusalem, And so it just seems that to be there, and in order to defend himself before people like King Agrippa II, that he would have had to have been able to manage the languages of those places. It's likely that Paul came to Jerusalem in the early 30s, probably before Stephen's death, because of course Paul was there at Stephen's death. And perhaps he came there to study the law. I mean, he was focused on God's law, on God's word, on the Pentateuch. And so it may have been the case that he came to Jerusalem to study law, but then the idea of him being in Jerusalem became exaggerated or romanticized by by Luke, who makes us believe that Paul was in Jerusalem longer than Paul was likely in Jerusalem.
So if he was highly educated, he had a great perspective on cultures that existed there, he had tremendous knowledge of the religion, the Hebrew religion. How, and he was the son of Pharisees, how does that coincide with being a tent maker? I don't understand what a tent maker does.
With that education.
Or why he would be a tent maker.
So the question is, why would he be a tent maker? If he had all of that education, why would St. Paul be a tent maker? I can't answer that. Apart from saying that everyone has to support him or herself, so the question would rightly be raised. With the person of Paul's education, what jobs would have been available? Because there's one thing about having an education, but there's also another thing of being raised, for instance, by our parents. Even though perhaps I've studied certain things and have certain degrees, that doesn't necessarily mean my father has those. So, maybe we could imagine that. What if we were to speculate that Paul's father was a tent maker who raised the early Paul, Saul, in his trade so that he would be able to support himself? It's all speculation.
It also could be, Father, that just because you're called a tent maker doesn't mean that you're the one that's making the tents. I've got all these employees that are doing it. I'm just one with the money to back that up, pay my employees and produce. Still
There you
be
go.
called a tent maker.
It's pure speculation. That's one of the challenges. One of the challenges is that beyond these two sources, Paul's letters and the Acts of the Apostles, we'll never know. If it's not said in one of these two, it'll simply be speculation. Yikes, how's that for unsettling?